The Japanese retreat from the Kokoda track wasn't a collapse, it was a calculated withdrawal into a trap that the Allied command failed to see until the first bullets started flying. By November 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army had been pushed back from the mountains, but they weren't running away, they were digging in. They occupied a narrow, marshy strip of coastline stretching from Gona to Buna, a piece of land that looked like a simple objective on a map but functioned as a natural fortress in reality. General Douglas MacArthur, operating from the safety of Brisbane, believed his forces were merely mopping up the remnants of a defeated army. Intelligence reports trickling into headquarters suggested that only a few thousand starving, diseased survivors remained to be cleared out. This monumental miscalculation set the stage for one of the most lopsided and grueling struggles of the entire Pacific theater. The reality on the ground was far more sinister. Waiting in the tall grass and thick mud were nearly 12,000 Japanese troops, many of whom were fresh reinforcements or battle-hardened veterans of the campaigns in China and Southeast Asia. They had spent months preparing the beachhead positions. While the Allies thought they were chasing ghosts, the Japanese were building an interlocking network of defenses that turned the tropical paradise into a kill zone. The Japanese commander, Hadazo Adachi, knew that as long as they held these coastal points, they maintained a dagger pointed at the heart of Australia. They weren't just defending a beach, they were defending the gateway to the entire South Pacific. MacArthur was under immense pressure to deliver a victory. The American public was restless, and the Navy was grabbing the headlines with the fight for Guadalcanal. He needed a win on land, and he needed it fast. He pushed the Australian 7th Division and the American 32nd Infantry Division toward the coast with an optimism that bordered on negligence. The plan was simple, a rapid pincer movement to crush the Japanese against the sea. But the Allied commanders were looking at paper maps, not the impenetrable labyrinth of the New Guinea lowlands. They assumed the Japanese would fold under a standard infantry assault, failing to realize that their enemy had nowhere left to go and every intention of dying where they stood. The logistics of the advance quickly became a nightmare. To reach the front, Allied troops had to traverse the very mountains the Japanese had just vacated or be flown into primitive jungle airstrips that were often underwater. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point before the first shot was even fired. Soldiers arrived at the front already exhausted, their uniforms rotting off their backs and their boots falling apart in the humidity. They were told they were facing a broken enemy, but as the columns emerged from the jungle canopy onto the coastal plains, they found a landscape that offered no cover and an enemy that refused to be seen. The stage was set for a collision between MacArthur's ego and the grim reality of Japanese engineering. The Allied soldiers were about to find out that the easy cleanup they were promised was actually a descent into a specific kind of hell that no training manual could have prepared them for. The coastal heat was just the beginning. The real horror was hidden beneath the roots of the coconut trees. The transition from the mountain peaks to the coastal lowlands felt like moving from a refrigerator into a furnace. As the Allied troops descended toward the coast, the landscape shifted from rugged slopes to a vast, stagnant basin of swamps and tidal flats. This wasn't the picturesque beach scene many had anticipated. It was a sodden, putrid environment where the land and sea blurred into a single mass of black muck. The ground was so unstable that a man could sink to his waist in a matter of seconds, and the thick, sulfuric smell of rotting vegetation hung in the air like a physical weight. Under the canopy, the humidity stayed at a permanent 100%, making it impossible for sweat to evaporate. Uniforms never dried, and skin began to soften and peel away in a condition the men simply called jungle rot. The vegetation itself was an active enemy. Vast stretches of the battlefield were covered in kunai grass, a species that grows 7 feet tall and possesses blades as sharp as straight razors. Moving through it was like walking through a field of glass shards. It trapped the heat so effectively that temperatures inside the grass patches often soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing soldiers to collapse from heat exhaustion within minutes of exertion.
Because the grass was so dense, visibility was reduced to a few feet, turning every step into a gamble. A Japanese sniper could be standing 5 paces away, completely invisible, while the Allied soldier was silhouetted against the bright tropical sky. The medical situation quickly spiraled into a catastrophe that threatened to destroy the 32nd Infantry Division before they even engaged the main Japanese line. Malaria was the primary executioner. Without enough quinine to go around, the fever ripped through the ranks with terrifying speed. In some companies, every single man was infected. Soldiers shook with uncontrollable chills in the midday sun, their bodies wasted away by a combination of fever and dysentery. The water supply was a toxic brew of runoff and bacteria. Men were forced to drink from shell holes or swamp pools, which only accelerated the spread of disease. For every soldier hit by a Japanese bullet, 5 more were evacuated for medical reasons. The 126th Infantry Regiment, for example, saw its strength vanish not in a glorious charge, but in a slow, agonizing drain of sick calls and stretcher bearers. Logistics were a cruel joke played by the geography. There were no roads, only narrow, muddy footpaths that turned into rivers after the daily afternoon deluges. Everything had to be carried on the backs of men. The Australian fuzzy-wuzzy Angels, the native carriers who had been the heroes of the Kokoda track, remained the only reliable way to move supplies, but even they struggled with the knee-deep coastal mire. Rations consisted largely of bully beef and hard biscuits that frequently arrived moldy or infested with maggots. The American troops had arrived wearing standard-issue khaki uniforms, which were intended for desert or garrison duty. These bright tan clothes acted like a neon sign in the deep green of the jungle, making the GIs easy targets. Many men resorted to boiling their clothes in a mixture of green dye and dirt just to have a chance at concealment. The psychological toll of this environment was immense. The soldiers were trapped in a world where the sun was a threat, the water was poison, and the very grass could draw blood. They were constantly wet, constantly hungry, and constantly surrounded by the sounds of a jungle that seemed to be cheering for their demise. This geographical nightmare provided the perfect screen for the Japanese defenders. While the Allies were struggling just to stay upright in the mud, the Japanese were watching from the shadows of the coconut groves. They had become part of the swamp, and as the first Allied patrols pushed toward the village of Gona, they realized that the environment wasn't just a backdrop for the battle. It was the foundation of a Japanese defense system that was about to turn the swamp into a massive, inescapable graveyard.
The Allied soldiers soon discovered that they weren't fighting an army so much as they were fighting the ground itself. As the patrols moved toward the tree line at Buna, the silent jungle suddenly erupted in a synchronized roar of heavy machine guns. Men were cut down in seconds, but there was no visible target to fire back at. The Japanese had spent months constructing hundreds of bunkers or pillboxes that were masterpieces of defensive engineering. These were not the flimsy wooden shacks the Allied intelligence had described. Instead, they were low-slung, subterranean fortresses built from layers of massive coconut palm logs. The Japanese chose this material because palm wood is naturally fibrous and spongy. It doesn't shatter like oak or pine. When an Allied shell hit a coconut log, the wood simply absorbed the impact, often leaving the structure completely intact. The construction was incredibly sophisticated for a swamp. Between the layers of logs, the Japanese packed sand, crushed coral, and thick mud. These bunkers were so heavy and well anchored that they could withstand a direct hit from a 75mm pack howitzer. Most were built mostly below ground level, with only a few inches of the firing slits protruding above the muck. To make them even more invisible, the defenders carefully replanted the surrounding kunai grass and vines over the tops of the mounds. An American soldier could be standing 5 feet away from a machine gun nest and see nothing but a natural hump in the earth until the first muzzle flash revealed the truth. By then, it was usually too late. The true genius and horror of this layout was the interlocking fields of fire.
Each bunker was positioned to protect its neighbors. If an Allied squad tried to crawl toward one pillbox to throw a grenade, they would find themselves caught in a crossfire from two other hidden positions they hadn't even noticed. It was a deadly geometry that turned the swamp into a series of overlapping kill zones. To make matters worse, many of these bunkers were connected by deep, waterlogged trenches. This allowed the Japanese to move troops and ammunition between positions without ever exposing themselves to Allied fire. A bunker that seemed silenced one minute would be remanned and firing again the next, creating the illusion of an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Standard Allied infantry tactics were useless against these structures. Mortars, which usually rained down from above, were ineffective because the heavy log roofs shrugged off the shrapnel. Hand grenades were difficult to toss into the narrow, slit-like apertures, and many simply bounced off the sandbagged front and exploded harmlessly in the mud. The Allied troops lacked heavy tanks in the early stages, and the dense jungle made it impossible to bring up large-scale artillery. This left the infantry with the suicidal task of crawling through the muck inch by inch, trying to shove explosives into the firing slits while being hunted by snipers hidden in the palm canopies above. The Japanese defenders had also cleared fire lanes through the undergrowth, cutting down just enough vegetation to give their machine gunners a clear view while leaving the Allied attackers in the dark. They even used daisy cutters, grenades or mines rigged at ankle height to shred the legs of anyone trying to rush the bunkers. The psychological effect on the American and Australian troops was devastating. They were being decimated by an invisible foe that seemed to have emerged from the very roots of the trees. Every clearing was a trap, every mound of dirt was a fortress, and the silence of the jungle was merely the prelude to a storm of lead. This tactical stalemate on the ground was about to trigger a massive explosion of frustration in the Allied High Command, thousands of miles away from the mud and the blood.
While the men in the swamps were dying of typhus and lead, the Allied High Command in Brisbane was dying of impatience. General Douglas MacArthur was a man obsessed with his public image and the speed of his return to the Philippines. From his comfortable headquarters 1,200 miles away, the lack of progress at Buna looked like cowardice rather than a tactical stalemate. He was receiving sanitized reports that didn't mention the chest-deep mud or the invisible bunkers. To him, the failure to overrun the Japanese positions was a stain on the American military reputation, especially since the Australians had been making slow, bloody gains elsewhere. This disconnect between the map room and the front line created a toxic atmosphere of distrust that nearly broke the American 32nd Infantry Division before the Japanese could. The 32nd Division, composed of National Guardsmen from Michigan and Wisconsin, was never intended for this kind of war. They had been rushed into the jungle with almost no training in tropical combat. Before they even saw a Japanese soldier, a large portion of the division had been sent on a grueling march over the Ghost Mountain Trail, a path so steep and treacherous that it left the men physically shattered. By the time they reached the outskirts of Buna, they were green troops in name only. In reality, they were walking ghosts. They were out of food, their uniforms were in tatters, and their officers were being replaced at a staggering rate. When their initial attacks against the Japanese bunkers were shredded by machine gun fire, the men naturally went to ground. MacArthur saw this hesitation not as a survival instinct, but as a lack of fighting spirit. The situation reached a breaking point in late November. MacArthur summoned Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger to his headquarters for a meeting that would become legendary for its cold-blooded intensity. MacArthur didn't ask for a report, he issued an ultimatum. He told Eichelberger to go to the front, relieve the current commanders, and take Buna, or not come back alive. He specifically told Eichelberger that if he failed, he shouldn't bother showing up for a burial, as he would be replaced by someone who could get the job done. This wasn't just a command, it was a threat aimed at the very heart of the American officer corps.
Eichelberger flew to the front the next day, expecting to find a group of cowards. What he found instead was a humanitarian disaster. Upon arriving at the front lines, Eichelberger was horrified. He saw men who had been in the same wet clothes for weeks, their skin covered in sores and their eyes sunken from starvation. He realized that the lack of spirit MacArthur complained about was actually the physical inability of the human body to function without fuel or medicine. In a rare move for a three-star general, Eichelberger abandoned the safety of the rear and began walking the front lines, often wearing his silver rank stars despite the risk of snipers. He fired incompetent officers on the spot, but he also did something more important. He demanded better food, more cigarettes, and actual medical supplies. This shift in leadership didn't magically clear the Japanese bunkers, but it stopped the internal rot of the American forces. Eichelberger realized that the only way forward was to stop the suicidal frontal charges across open ground and start using small unit tactics, combined with whatever heavy support they could scavenge. He understood that MacArthur's ultimatum was a death sentence if he followed the old playbook. The battle was no longer just about defeating the Japanese. It was a race to prove that the American soldier could adapt to the jungle before the jungle and the high command consumed them entirely. This desperate reorganization was happening just as the Australians were preparing their own final brutal push toward the village of Guinea, setting the stage for a coordinated bloodbath that would finally crack the Japanese shell.
While the Americans were reorganizing under Eichelberger's shadow, the Australian 7th Division was locked in a savage struggle for Guinea just a few miles to the west. These were the men who had already survived the mountain peaks of the Kokoda Track, but they found the coastal flats to be a different kind of hell. Guinea was a small mission station that had been transformed into a labyrinth of filth and fire. The Australian veterans, many of whom were already skeletal from months of mountain warfare, were thrown into a meat grinder where the distances were measured in feet rather than miles. The 21st Brigade led the charge, attacking across open ground that the Japanese had meticulously cleared to create perfect killing fields. There was no room for tactical elegance here. The battle for Guinea became a series of brutal, close-quarters brawls. Australian soldiers would crawl through the stinking mud, pushing their rifles ahead of them, trying to find a gap in the coconut log walls. The Japanese defenders at Guinea were cornered with their backs to the sea, and they fought with a suicidal intensity that shocked even the most hardened veterans. They had been ordered to hold until the end, and they took that order literally. In many cases, the Japanese stayed in their bunkers even after they ran out of ammunition, waiting with bayonets or sharpened bamboo poles to take one last enemy with them. The physical conditions inside the Guinea perimeter reached a level of depravity that is hard to overstate. Because the ground was a swamp, neither side could bury their dead. The Japanese fought from bunkers built on top of the decomposing remains of their own comrades. The stench was so overpowering that Australian troops often vomited while trying to aim their weapons. It was a war of attrition in its purest, most disgusting form. Soldiers on both sides were covered in a layer of grime, blood, and swamp muck that made it nearly impossible to tell friend from foe at a distance. The Australians eventually resorted to sniping the bunkers with Bren guns, firing thousands of rounds at a single log until the wood splintered enough to allow a grenade to be tossed inside. To the east of Guinea lay Sanananda, perhaps the most dreaded location of the entire campaign. The road to Sanananda was a narrow track flanked by impassable swamps. The Japanese had established a series of roadblocks that completely cut off the Allied advance. One of these became famous as Huggins Roadblock, named after Captain Allen Huggins. A small force of Australians and Americans managed to slip behind the Japanese lines and occupy a patch of ground on the road, effectively surrounding the surrounders. For weeks, these men lived in a tiny perimeter, completely cut off, surviving on supplies dropped from the air that usually landed in the swamp and rotted. They were under constant mortar fire and suffered from 100% infection of malaria, yet they held the line, preventing the Japanese from reinforcing the coast. The 39th Battalion, the famous Chacos who had held the line at Kokoda, were eventually brought in to finish the job at Gona. By this point, they were a shadow of a unit, with some companies reduced to the size of a single squad. Yet on December 9th, after weeks of relentless pressure and a final desperate bayonet charge, Gona fell. The signals sent back to headquarters were 3 words: "Gona's gone." But the victory offered no celebration. When the Australians walked through the ruins, they found a wasteland of craters and corpses. They had won, but the cost had been nearly 50% casualties in the units involved. The victory at Gona proved that the Japanese could be beaten, but it also proved that infantry alone could not continue this pace without being completely annihilated. They needed something that could withstand the machine guns and crush the logs. They needed armor.
The realization that infantry alone would be bled white before the bunkers were cleared led to a desperate logistical gamble, bringing tanks into a swamp. In mid-December, the Allies managed to land several Australian-manned M3 Stuart light tanks at Aro Bay and move them toward the front. On paper, it seemed impossible. These were 15-ton steel boxes being asked to drive over ground that couldn't support a man's weight. To get them to the front, engineers had to build corduroy roads, laying thousands of coconut logs side by side to create a makeshift floor over the mud. Every yard of progress was a triumph of engineering over nature. When the Stuarts finally clattered onto the battlefield at Buna, the psychological shift was instantaneous. For weeks, the American and Australian infantry had been pinned down, unable to lift their heads without losing them. Now they had mobile steel shields. The Japanese, who had felt invincible behind their palm logs, suddenly faced a weapon they couldn't stop. Their standard 7.7mm machine gun bullets simply bounced off the Stuarts' armor like hailstones. The Japanese did have some anti-tank guns, but in the thick vegetation, they struggled to track the tanks as they lunged through the kunai grass. The tactics were brutal and direct. The tanks would lumber toward a hidden bunker, guided by infantrymen who literally walked alongside the tracks, pointing out targets while being showered with dirt and bullets. Once a bunker was identified, the Stuart would pull up to within 20 feet and fire its 37mm cannon point blank into the firing slits. If that didn't work, the tank would simply drive over the mound, using its weight to collapse the log structure and bury the defenders alive inside their own fortress. It was a terrifying, mechanical execution of a previously immovable enemy. However, the Iron Cavalry paid a heavy price. The Stuarts were cramped, and the heat inside surpassed 120 degrees, making the crews dizzy and prone to fainting. Because visibility was almost zero, tank commanders often had to keep their hatches open to see where they were going, leaving them vulnerable to Japanese snipers who waited in the trees specifically for that moment. In one famous instance, Japanese soldiers actually leaped onto the moving tanks, trying to pry open the hatches or jam grenades into the tracks. It was a chaotic, primeval form of armored warfare, where the distance between a tank and its hunter was often less than the length of a rifle. Despite the losses, the arrival of the tanks broke the back of the Japanese defense. The interlocking zones of fire that had paralyzed the Allies for a month began to crumble as one anchor point after another was crushed into the mud. For the first time, the Allied troops began to see the Japanese retreating toward the sea. The aura of the invisible, invincible Japanese jungle fighter was shattered. But as the perimeter shrank, the nature of the battle changed from a tactical struggle into a desperate, fanatical last stand.
The Japanese had nowhere left to run, and the Allies were about to discover the horrific lengths a starving, cornered army would go to in its final hours.
As the perimeter tightened around the final Japanese positions at Buna and Sanananda, the battle transcended the limits of organized warfare and descended into a scene of pure, unadulterated horror. The Japanese defenders were now completely cut off. Their supply ships had been sunk by Allied aircraft, leaving them with no food, no medicine, and almost no ammunition. Yet the Japanese code of Bushido forbade surrender. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe, where the living were forced to exist alongside the dead. Allied troops who eventually overran the Japanese positions found scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Japanese soldiers living as skeletons had been surviving on handfuls of grass, roots, and in some documented cases, the flesh of their fallen comrades and even Allied prisoners. The desperation of the Japanese was matched by the grim determination of the Allies to end the slaughter. In late December and early January, the Americans finally broke through to the sea at Buna Mission. This split the Japanese forces into isolated pockets, but even then, they refused to yield. Each bunker had to be cleared with flamethrowers and high explosives. The smell of burning oil and roasting flesh mixed with the existing stench of the swamp, creating an atmosphere that one American soldier described as the porch of hell. There was no room for mercy. The Japanese often feigned death, only to pull the pin on a grenade when a medic or soldier approached. This led to a no-prisoners mentality among many Allied units, where any Japanese movement was met with a hail of bullets. During this final phase, the American public received a massive psychological jolt. In September 1943, Life magazine published a photograph taken by George Strock on Buna Beach. It showed 3 American soldiers lying dead in the sand, their bodies half buried and rotting near a wrecked landing craft. It was the first time the U.S. government allowed the publication of a photo showing dead American troops. The image was released because the High Command realized that the public's perception of the war as a series of clean, heroic victories was dangerous. Buna Gona was the cold water thrown in the face of the world, proving that the road to Tokyo would be paved with the bodies of boys from Michigan and Queensland. By mid-January 1943, the organized resistance finally collapsed. The Japanese commanders, General Oda and Colonel Yasawa, performed ritual suicide or died in final charges. A few hundred Japanese soldiers attempted to swim out to sea or flee into the trackless swamps, where most were either eaten by crocodiles or claimed by starvation. Of the nearly 12,000 Japanese who had occupied the beachheads, only a handful of prisoners were taken, mostly those too sick or wounded to kill themselves. The Allies had won, but they had also been transformed. The 32nd Division had been practically erased as a fighting force, losing nearly 90% of its original strength to casualties and disease. The lessons learned at Buna Gona were written in blood. The U.S. Army realized that their equipment, training, and medical protocols were woefully inadequate for the Pacific. They began to issue better camouflage, developed more effective anti-malarial drugs, and prioritized the use of portable flamethrowers and tanks in jungle assaults. More importantly, the Allied command realized that they didn't need to storm every Japanese stronghold. They learned the strategy of leapfrogging, bypassing heavily fortified positions like Buna and leaving them to wither on the vine. The carnage of the New Guinea coast ensured that the Allies would never again underestimate the Japanese soldier or the deadly power of the tropical environment.